Racial inequality creates subgroups whose hyper-exploitation forms the foundations for capitalist industry. The tech industry requires metals mined by hyper-exploited people such as children in the Congo. The food industry requires surpluses produced by hyper-exploited migrant laborers as well as third-world peasants. The 19th century global textile industry required the hyper-exploitation of African slaves in the American South. As Karl Marx put it, the veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe needed for its pedestal slavery pure and simple in the New World. In the United States, capitalism has always organized itself racially through a settler colonialist democracy that entitles white people to exploit, exclude, and exterminate racialized lessers in their pursuit of wealth. Perhaps nothing embodies the settler colonialist democracy more than the American West, that famous region of cowboys and rugged individualism. 19th century historian Frederick Jackson Turner argued that American history has been in a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West, which according to him developed American democracy and individualism. In this video I explore how racial capitalism conquered the American West through this myth of exceptionalist democracy. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Territory from France in what was the largest land purchase in U.S. history. This was hypocritical considering that Jefferson supposedly believed the federal government was limited only to powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution, which did not authorize land purchases. But Jeffersonians also believed that land ownership was necessary for a virtuous republic. Having nothing of their own to protect, wage workers could not be counted upon to help maintain a republic. Thus, to Jeffersonians, democracy depended upon providing land for every white man. Land acquisition animated American politics throughout the 19th century. Andrew Jackson made his fame conquering Seminole and Creek lands in Florida, and as president he removed Cherokees from the southeast to clear room for plantation agriculture, which was justified with a variant of Jeffersonian republicanism that claimed slave owning provided slave owners with the necessary leisure time to undertake the responsibilities of democratic citizenship. In 1845, James Polk ascended to the nation's highest office on a platform of territorial expansion. Almost immediately, he launched war against Mexico, and in 1848 acquired much of what is now the western United States. Whether these lands would be slave or free fueled the Civil War. The victors of that war, Republicans, envisioned populating the West with independent farms, which would alleviate the class conflicts created by industrial capitalism's growth. During the Civil War, Republicans promoted white settlement of the West with a series of policies including the Homestead Act, which allowed a person to claim 160 acres of public land, the funding of transcontinental railroads to carry Western goods to Eastern markets, and the creation of the Department of Agriculture as well as the Morrill Land Grant Act to establish universities that could teach farmers the kinds of science necessary to successfully farm in the West. These policies failed to fill the West with independent farms. Corporations and speculators circumvented land limitations by paying people to make claims for them. Something like half of all homesteads were acquired fraudulently in the late 19th century, and by 1900, two-thirds of all homesteaders had given up their farms to banks and to real estate speculators. With all this discussion of land policy, we shouldn't forget that this land was already occupied by indigenous peoples, whom whites considered savages who had to go away either through assimilation or annihilation. Actually, assimilation was an illusion. There was nothing Native Americans could have done to keep their land, as illustrated by the dispossession of what were called the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek. They were literate, had schools and churches, farmed. They already resembled ideas about American civilization. Still, the federal government forcibly moved them to Oklahoma. Americans continued to encounter Native peoples as they moved west. Two of the more powerful native nations were the Cheyenne in the northern plains and the Comanche in the southern plains, who had reinvented their societies to take advantage of horses. At their peak, they numbered tens of thousands and were formidable enough to block Spain and Mexico from colonizing the western United States. Texas only exists today because Mexico invited white settlers to act as a buffer between them and the Comanches. In direct confrontations, the U.S. military couldn't defeat them either, so the military targeted their resources and nearly extinguished the bison. The cattle settlers brought with them clumped along rivers, where their hooves destroyed the vegetation that bison and horses needed. Unlike Native Americans of the plains, settlers could access resources from the east, which was obsessed with extracting gold and silver from the western regions. Between 1840 and 1865, the Comanche population fell 90%, and the U.S. government forced them onto reservations. Early Gold Rush California quintessentially represented American democracy. Anyone could claim mining lands as long as they worked them. Settlers protected each other's rights and claims, but only for fellow whites. White immigrants formed militias to terrorize Chinese, Native American, and Mexican immigrants. Voluntarist militias historically have been central to American democracy. The Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights states that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. The colonies established militias to fight Native Americans, and in wars against indigenous peoples, settlers of different ethnicities developed a shared racial consciousness. Manifest Destiny, the idea that the expansion of the American nation from coast to coast was divinely ordained, assumed the genocide of Native Americans. Americans learned from history books, novels, and their parents that they were heirs to a pioneering tradition which was purportedly bringing civilization to the wilderness. As one Eastern newspaper put it, the California Native American would soon enough disappear in the inevitable course of that destiny, which has opened the long-hidden treasures of the Pacific coast to the energies of civilization. The Arkansas Gazette asked why pioneers of the day should shrink from the journey when their forefathers had defeated savages more numerous and warlike by far than the California Indians. In his 1851 address to the state legislature, Governor Peter Burnett declared that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Not everyone wanted to exterminate Native Americans. After all, miners were too obsessed with striking it rich to grow their own food. In 1850, California passed an act for the government and protection of Indians. This act allowed authorities to arrest any idle or drunk Native American and sell them into indentured servitude. 12-year-old virgin girls went for the most money at auctions. To avoid idleness, California natives competed for scarce jobs that paid as little as 50 cents a day, about 1/6 the typical miner income. Some employers paid only with alcohol, and when California natives got drunk, they would be arrested and sold back as slaves. Wage work meant natives couldn't gather winter supplies, so starvation ensued. When they stole cattle and horses to stave off starvation, whites formed volunteer companies and indiscriminately slaughtered natives. Newspapers incited violence by falsely attributing nearly every instance of murder and missing livestock to Native Americans. Even though most murders were white-on-white crimes, and livestock frequently went missing in a long tradition of valuing property above the lives of racialized others, the Chico Weekly Courant insisted that nothing but extermination will keep them from committing their depredations. It is a false notion of humanity to save the lives of these red devils. There should be no prisoners taken, but a general sacrifice made of the whole race. Like the wild beast of prey, they are necessarily exterminated by the march of civilization. In one particularly brutal incident, a volunteer company invaded the island of the peaceful and unarmed Wiyot people and hacked 188 of them to death with axes and knives. Most were women and children. The journalist who reported this massacre was chased out of town by a lynch mob. Slavery, massacres, and the devastation of ecosystems reduced the California native population from 150,000 in 1850 to 15,000 in 1900. Lest we blame this on European epidemic diseases, the Spanish had been in California for over 70 years before the gold rush. Many whites eventually settled down to farm. They expected wealth to come easily. Instead, they encountered an unforgiving climate where less than 20 inches of rain fell a year, the minimum needed for non-irrigated agriculture. When white farmers failed to make it, they blamed natives for taking the best lands. So Congress in 1887 passed the Dawes Severalty Act. Purportedly, this act was about assimilating Native Americans, to in other words, destroy Native American communal economies. Under this act, Native Americans were allotted 160 acres of land that they would not get to own until after 25 years of farming. First, they had to prove their individualism and productivity, because freedom meant only the freedom to live as productive, individualistic white Christians. After all, the whole basis of dispossessing natives was that they had failed to use land profitably. Freedom and rights was and is contingent on how one contributes to the capitalist economy. Once the reservations were divided into small farms, white settlers got the rest. Within 20 years, Native Americans lost half their lands. Poverty reigned supreme on native farms. How could it not? If white farmers with the best seed and tools and the most fertile lands could hardly make it, how could Native Americans be expected to survive on the most marginal lands? They were set up to fail, and then whites blamed savageness for that failure. To cope, some turned to prophetic religions. One of the most famous was the version of the ghost dance taught by a Native American ranch worker, Wovoka, who taught that Native Americans should love one another, work hard, never complain, and every so often come together, link hands in a circle, and move round and round until they had ecstatic visions. Through this dance, Christ would return, raise those who had died, and restore their lands. All federal agents saw was failure to assimilate. They particularly disliked how women danced with men. Newspapers also stoked national hysteria with false information. On December 29, 1890, the U.S. Army sent soldiers to the Lakota Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. When a gun went off during confiscations, soldiers opened fire, chased and killed those who tried to flee, and sent cavalry to scour the hills for escapees. Altogether, they massacred 300 people. This was the last of the numerous massacres perpetrated against Native Americans, and it was not because the Lakota had failed to assimilate. After all, the ghost dance wasn't any more wild than the behavior that went on in Pentecostal churches. But to most white Americans, anything a Native American did was savage. It wasn't just Native Americans who faced racism. Chinese immigrants did the jobs that white workers wouldn't do, including reclaiming the swampy San Francisco Delta, dangerous work that entailed diseases such as malaria, frequent flooding, and deaths from exhaustion. They also picked most of the fruits and vegetables. Still, white workers scapegoated them, especially during the 1870s Depression. White workers joined groups such as the Order of Caucasians to terrorize Chinese workers. In 1877, whites drove the Chinese from the Rockland-Roseville area and destroyed their 245 buildings. On a daily level, xenophobia was pervasive. Children played cruel jokes. Small boys stole and scattered veggies and laundry from Chinese wagons and stoned Chinese on the street. In San Francisco, an Irish immigrant named Dennis Kearney formed the Working Men's Party, whose primary issue was the banning of Chinese labor. They argued the Chinese were tools of monopolistic capitalists. California did have massive farms and intense inequality. The most famous explanation for this inequality came from Henry George, who argued in Progress and Poverty that concentrated land ownership caused poverty because landlords could expropriate economic growth all for themselves through rents. George claimed that land barons deployed Chinese coolie labor to work their vast estates, driving down white wages. This reasoning is what David Roediger calls Herrenvolk republicanism, a style of politics that claims elites exploit non-white people to deprive middling whites.
I feel like what's taking place in America right now is a slow-moving invasion. Our country's being taken advantage of.
We see similar arguments today with Mexican immigration. But when Alabama and Georgia passed strict immigration enforcement laws in 2011, there was no influx of white workers. Instead, watermelon production in Alabama declined 65%, and Georgia lost $140 million of crops. Whether that is because growers simply refuse to pay a wage high enough to attract labor, or because there are some jobs white laborers consider beneath them, is immaterial. Racialized others do not cost whites jobs and money. Yet white workers insisted that Chinese workers drove their standard of living down to the level of slavery. In 1879, California passed a new constitution, approved by over 90% of the population, which prohibited the government and corporations from employing Chinese workers. After years of far western agitation, Congress banned the immigration of Chinese laborers with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Never before had an entire race or nationality been banned. America's immigration restriction regime would only grow over time. Today, the agency overseeing immigration, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, employs over 20,000 people. As the number of Chinese immigrants declined, the number of Japanese immigrants increased. By the early 20th century, Japanese immigrants farmed 10% of the land and accounted for 20% of all California's agricultural production. It was common practice for agro-capitalists to set racialized wage rates. White farm workers got paid 50% more than Asian ones. To erase this disparity, Japanese farm workers would collectively negotiate wages at the peak of harvest season, threatening to ruin the harvest by walking off the job if their demands weren't met. Through these tactics, they raised harvest wages 50% between 1889 and 1903. To counteract Japanese solidarity, growers formed the Western Agricultural Contracting Company to hire out independent contractors. In response, Japanese workers organized a union with Mexican farm workers, the Japanese Mexican Labor Association, and in 1903 launched a sugar beet strike at Oxnard. Japanese and Mexican Mutual Aid Associations supported the striking workers, who confronted and converted scabs. Despite facing violence from hired guards and media reports falsely reporting striker violence, the JMLA prevailed, breaking the Western Agricultural Contracting Company and obtaining the right to handle sugar beet contracts. Despite the organizational successes of Japanese farm workers, racist stereotypes and racialist hierarchy disallowed white labor leaders, such as Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor, from perceiving Japanese immigrants as anything other than filthy, diseased people who were impossible to organize. In 1906, representatives from more than 100 unions formed the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. They couldn't legally ban Japanese immigration until 1924, because Japan was a rising power in the Pacific and President Theodore Roosevelt feared offending a strong imperial power. Instead, Roosevelt negotiated a gentleman's agreement where Japan agreed to voluntarily cut off emigration. Western states also tried to divest Japanese farmers of their land by passing land restriction acts beginning in 1914, which made it illegal for aliens ineligible for citizenship to own land. Aliens ineligible for citizenship refer to the fact that until 1965, only white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. If workers drew distinctions to claim privileges, it was only because capitalism had taught them how to draw such distinctions. The entire labor force of the 19th century economy was built on a racialized division of labor. In Eastern factories, only men of Western European ancestry were allowed to do skilled work or ascend to managerial positions. Few companies exploited racial hierarchies to greater profit than Miller and Lux, the largest cattle and meat packing company west of Chicago. Like most corporations, they deployed a multi-branch structure consisting of middle managers, skilled workers, and unskilled laborers. Native Americans and Mexican Americans herded the cattle and saw their wages progressively decline over the late 19th century. Chinese immigrants served exclusively as cooks. Italian and Irish immigrants performed the manual labor, such as digging ditches. Managerial and office positions, such as ranch supervisors or accountants, went exclusively to men of Western European descent. They alone enjoyed yearly wage increases, as well as benefits such as pensions and stock options. They also eagerly embraced and promoted social Darwinist theories attributing the success of men like them to innate superiority, and insisted that those of lesser races should just accept their lot in life. While making $800 a week, the notorious classical liberal William Graham Sumner asserted that a worker who is unable to live on $6 a week is not fit to live. Hyper-exploitation of racialized others went along with hyper-exploitation of the environment to make capitalism work. Industrialization requires three ingredients: land, labor, and capital. The West lacked labor and capital, but made up for it with huge amounts of free natural resources. Giant mining corporations promiscuously exploited available wood to build their sluices. Just 20 years after statehood, capitalists had cut down 1/3 of the state's forests. As mining companies exhausted usable forests, they turned to redwoods, which are very thick and would have required steam-powered saws to cut at the base. Instead, loggers cut trees about 10 to 12 feet up from the trunk and left the rest of the tree behind, where it dried out, rotted, and then fueled massive forest fires. Mining companies just blasted apart hillsides with water from the streams, releasing over 1.5 billion cubic yards of debris into the California rivers, killing entire aquatic ecosystems, including those Native Americans needed to survive. In the Sacramento Valley alone, mining debris destroyed 40,000 acres of prime farmland and raised riverbeds. The bed of the Yuba River eventually rose as high as the tops of the houses in Marysville, exacerbating already severe and destructive flooding. To separate gold from debris, mining companies use mercury, a highly toxic substance. Today, mercury can be found in the soil or in virtually any lake, bay, or stream where precious metals were once mined or refined. As was the case with reclaiming the Delta, the dangerous work of mining and refining mercury was performed by a racialized other, Mexican Americans. Within a half mile of mercury mines and furnaces, cattle sickened and trees shrunk and died. After just 1 week working at the furnaces, employees suffered from pale, cadaverous faces and leaden eyes. Manufacturing released toxic substances such as sulfur, carbon monoxide, ozone, and other bad particulates into the air, and lung ailments accounted for 3/5 of all deaths in California cities. The myth of the American West continues to dominate American politics. Under the pretext of preserving small family farms, the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps of Engineers built thousands of dams on nearly every major river in the United States. 15,000 dams now have high hazard potential, according to FEMA. Most of the water and electricity from these dams goes to massive factory farms, representing billions of dollars every year in subsidies for millionaire farmers, who claim this as their rights as Americans. The workers themselves get nothing. Agricultural communities are the poorest and most polluted in the nation and have workplace death rates 50% higher than the national average. In other ways, racial capitalism still operates insidiously. Assimilationist ideology informed 20th century reformers who blamed non-white cultures for poverty. But as the fate of the 5 civilized tribes in the Dakota show, poverty was not created by a failure to assimilate, but by a system that necessitates inequality, that produces winners and losers, and that does so often along the lines of race. Today, Black Americans are twice as likely to be unemployed as whites at all education levels. Agriculture depends on exploiting Latin American workers who exist outside any system of labor protections, and most goods are produced by hyper-exploited labor in the global South. Whiteness, however, is a fragile construct. Well into the 20th century, there were degrees of whiteness. Italians and Irish, for example, were less white than English persons. It must be constantly recreated and reinforced through history, the media, demagoguery, and even subtle concepts such as developing and developed. Yet there are still numerous instances of whites and non-whites acting together. I also don't want to leave on a tragic impression. The victims of racial capitalism continue to physically and culturally survive. So here are some suggested readings about Native American persistence and resistance. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting or informative, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe.